Hi everyone, welcome to part one of the Progressive Era. Our questions to think about here: where does the progressive movement come from, and who were the progressives? When we take a look at the origins of progressivism, it's important to understand the word itself. The root word of progressivism is progress, and progressives were people who were looking to make changes in American society. What's interesting is that some historians actually talk about progressive isms rather than one sort of grand progressive movement. And the reason they do that is that there were many different facets of the progressive era, and many progressives had different goals and hopes for American society. And oftentimes those goals were at odds with other progressives. So we'll get into that a little bit more as we look at who were the progressives. But it's important to understand that the progressive movement is an effort to reform and improve American society in a variety of ways. So what spawns this movement? What sort of helps it to develop? And first and foremost, we have the problems created by urbanization, industrialization, and immigration. As we mentioned with the Gilded Age, there were a lot of problems beneath the surface of this massive economic growth. And one of the things that progressives really focused on was improving these issues, addressing these problems. But another origin of the progressive movement was the populist movement of the late 19th century. And even though we did not discuss the expansion of settlements into the West during the Gilded Age, there was a movement initiated by Western and Southern farmers and ranchers and later Western miners that pushed for political reforms. The populists proposed many reforms, but they were able to accomplish only a few. And some of them would be later achieved by the progressives, as we'll see: the graduated income tax, changes to the banking system, conservation and preservation of natural resources, and government regulation of industries, especially the railroads. So the populist movement, even though it's considered to be less successful, it is definitely a forerunner of the progressive movement. And then finally, the socialist movement represents the left wing of progressivism, and some believed that radical changes were necessary. Others opposed the radicalism of socialist remedies, and they were concerned about the labor violence that was often associated with socialists and anarchists. And we're going to see the socialist movement as an important element of progressivism because, first of all, socialists as part of the labor movement had been pushing for change for quite a long time, but it builds into this larger progressive movement. And when we talk about the progressive era, we're talking about roughly 1890 to about 1920. And those dates are debatable among historians, but that gives you a general idea of when we're talking about. Socialists represent an important element of progressivism because in many ways they help to pull the movement leftward. In other words, towards a more liberal aspect. And there was actually conservative politicians that were willing to implement small changes in order to prevent the radical changes that the socialists wanted. So when we take a look at who were the progressives, honestly, this is a widespread movement. I mean, we can think about different categories of people who would call themselves progressives. It involved both men and women, Democrats, Republicans, and populists, labor unionists and business executives, teachers and professors, social workers, and municipal workers, and those with a religious affiliation and those who didn't. So we have this sort of cross-section of American society, but when we dig deeper, we can see some of the core elements of who made up the progressive movement. within this movement, we see a strong sense of professionalization of the middle class and the professionalization of government. And what this means is people are now looking to experts because we actually now have experts in certain fields. So whether it is a medical professional, a doctor, a nurse, describing how to sanitize a classroom or to deal with outbreaks of cholera or typhoid. What should the city do? Well, let's ask the experts. And when it comes to issues with immigration and urbanization or education, let's look to the newly formally trained teachers and social workers to help us solve those problems. So professionalization is really important because it combines two things that are building in American society. The increase in the number of people attending colleges and universities so that they become those experts, the engineers, the doctors, the lawyers, the teachers, the social workers. Those professionals are very proud of their credentials. And then the other thing is they're contributing to this expanding middle class. So people that are neither wealthy nor poor and really have an invested interest in improving American society. With this, we have a core group of progressives who were women. And women have a particular connection with the progressive movement because most women in most of the states could not vote. And so they could not be politically active in the same way that men could. And some people thought that women's work with the poor or with children was an acceptable extension of women's, quote, natural roles in the home as nurturers and housekeepers. And so it was considered to be acceptable for women to be politically active in these areas. So nurturing, something to do with the women's sphere. So if we think about, we would never see women go before the city council to discuss a political issue. But in the progressive era, if that issue included education or the children of immigrants or settlement houses, then it was considered to be an acceptable expression politically for these women. So the term municipal housekeeping, the word municipal means city, and housekeeping, of course, meaning the caretaking of the house. So if a woman envisioned the entire city as her home, then it was acceptable for her to be politically active in that realm. In addition, we have a growing civil rights movement in the United States. We have these sort of bursts of civil rights movements, and we'll talk about some of the other ones later on. But in this situation, we have a great example of how progressives often disagreed about strategies. So in the realm of civil rights, on the left, we have Booker T. Washington. Washington was born a slave in Virginia in 1856, and he and his family had worked in the salt and coal mines of West Virginia after the Civil War. In 1881, Washington founded the Tuskegee Institute for Black students in rural Alabama. He thought that the best method of improving the lives of his students would be if they learned a trade and workplace discipline. He argued that by learning industrial skills, that students could acquire self-respect and economic independence. And he clearly emphasized vocational training over the liberal arts. Now, what ends up happening for Booker T. Washington is that many people, including W.E.B. Du Bois on the right, would call him an accommodationist, that he was accommodating white society because he wasn't necessarily arguing for young African Americans to push for their political and social rights overtly. What he's saying is build yourself up economically. And you're going to do that by learning a trade, becoming a skilled worker. So for young men, he said, don't be a ditch digger. This is unskilled labor. Anybody can pick up a shovel. But if you're a carpenter, or a blacksmith, then you have skills that not everybody has. And so you're going to build a place for yourself economically. For young women, he said, don't be a domestic servant. Anyone can be a maid. Be a seamstress. And that is skilled work that will build yourself up economically. He says, at that point, let's worry about civil rights. Let's worry about social issues. On the flip side of this, we have W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois is going to challenge Washington's acceptance of Black social inequality. Du Bois was born in Massachusetts in 1868, and he was the first African American to earn a doctoral degree at Harvard University. He taught first at Atlanta University and is best known for writing more than a dozen books on various aspects of Black life in America. Du Bois was the co-founder of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This organization was founded in 1910 and continues to exist today. It was an interracial organization dedicated to restoring African American political and social rights. And so for Du Bois, it didn't matter if you were economically equal, as long as you were disenfranchised and subject to Jim Crow laws, then what did it really matter? So both of these men essentially have the same goal, which is African American social, economic, and political equality, but they have different routes to get there. Finally, when we consider who else could consider themselves to be progressives, we have the progressive presidents. And so these are the men who served during this time period who were interested in improving American society. And so we begin first with Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is an interesting character. He has a very colorful personality and served in a variety of roles. But in 1900, Theodore Roosevelt became William McKinley's running mate as the vice presidential candidate in that election. And then in 1901, McKinley was assassinated and Theodore Roosevelt became the president of the United States. Roosevelt is really going to be an activist president. And we get the term bully pulpit from Roosevelt because he really felt like the president shouldn't be playing second fiddle to Congress. And that had typically been the story really since the end of Abraham Lincoln's presidency. So during that time, the president was sort of inactive, relatively speaking, and Roosevelt's going to change that dramatically. And so we see this with enhancing executive power. And when we take a look at the other progressive presidents, we sort of feel these themes, enhancing executive power, regulating big business, and conserving natural resources. These are the things that made them progressive. Roosevelt's Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, was handpicked as his Republican successor. Taft was the son of a distinguished Ohio family and a graduate of Yale Law School. Taft was a legal scholar and would later be the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He and Roosevelt had become friends, and Roosevelt had a lot of respect for Taft. Taft was a progressive, but he was definitely more conservative than Roosevelt, even though he did file twice as many antitrust lawsuits as Roosevelt and set aside more public land for conservation purposes. We'll get into a little bit more of how the relationship of Taft and Roosevelt changes as we approach the 1912 election with our next slide here. Woodrow Wilson was the president of Princeton University and then later governor of New Jersey. The Democratic leaders in New Jersey had wanted a respectable conservative to help them ward off more progressive challengers. So it's interesting to note that Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft were both Republicans, but Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat. Woodrow Wilson was a Southern Democrat who distrusted the radical ideas of the populist elements of his party, and Wilson saw progressive reform as necessary to ward off more radical social changes. But once he was the president, Wilson pushed through a series of progressive reforms. And all of these three men are going to play a key role in the presidential election of 1912. So what happens here is Theodore Roosevelt had become the president in 1901, and then in 1904, he was reelected. But he had made a campaign promise that he would not seek essentially a third term, and that's when William Howard Taft comes on the scene. Taft is elected president in 1908. So coming into this election, Taft is running for re-election as a Republican. And then the Democratic candidate is Woodrow Wilson. But we also have the Socialist Party of America and their perennial candidate, Eugene Victor Debs. Eugene Debs was the president of the American Railway Union, and he is going to be one of the leading socialists in the United States. And we'll talk more later on about Mr. Debs. But in this election, to set the stage here, when William Howard Taft is elected president in 1908, Theodore Roosevelt recognizes that he has this sort of overbearing personality, and he doesn't want Taft's presidency to operate within his shadow. So he attends the inauguration and then leaves the country, goes off to Africa for safari, and then into Europe for several months for sort of a grand tour of the former president. But when he's in Europe, he learns some things about Taft, and it turns out that Taft is not the progressive that Theodore Roosevelt wanted him to be. And so he comes back and he starts to publish a series of newspaper articles that are extremely critical of Taft's presidency. And so in the end, Theodore Roosevelt is going to challenge Taft for the Republican nomination. Taft, though, as the sitting president and the leading Republican, essentially is going to be able to shut Roosevelt out and secure the nomination for himself. Roosevelt, undeterred, is going to be creating a new political party for himself, the Progressive Party. It earns the nickname the Bull Moose Party when a reporter asks former President Roosevelt if he's fit enough to run again, and Roosevelt's colorful response is, "I'm as fit as a bull moose." Woodrow Wilson, as we mentioned, the Democratic candidate, is relatively conservative. So in that realm, he follows along with the ideas of Taft. But during this campaign, Roosevelt and Wilson are going to continually work to out-progressive each other. In fact, by the end of the campaign, Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson end up much more progressive than either man had been earlier. But when we sort of back up and we look at the election of 1912, it has a couple of clear significances here. Each of the four candidates shared a basic progressive assumption that the old notion of do-nothing government was unacceptable, that more active government was necessary. And so it's considered to be the high point of progressivism. And we definitely see in the post-election moment a shift of the Republican Party to the conservative side, because Republican voters are forced to choose. Do you stick with the Republican Party and vote for Taft, or do you follow Theodore Roosevelt away from the party? And then once the election is over, then those Republican voters, those progressives, now have a choice. Do you go back to the Republican Party, or do you follow now the much more progressive Woodrow Wilson? And so many of them chose that latter path. And as a result, the Republican Party becomes much more conservative. The final significance here of the election of 1912 is the role of a third party in the election. Because Republican voters were forced to choose between Taft and Roosevelt, you split that voting cohort. And that means that party is going to lose. The Democrats aren't split necessarily. They're going to vote for Woodrow Wilson, even if they're not enthusiastic about him. So the danger of a third party in a presidential election is that the party that they're most similar to will lose. So for example, coming into the 2020 presidential election, if we see a conservative candidate challenge Donald Trump in the election, you're splitting that Republican vote, and that would probably mean success for the Democratic candidate. And on the flip side, of course, if Bernie Sanders decides to make a resurgence in this election, that would mean that the Democrats are being split by those two candidates, and the Republican candidate would most likely win. So coming back to our questions to think about, where does the progressive movement come from? We see the origins of the progressive movement in the problems of the Gilded Age, but also the earlier reform movement of the populists and the socialists. Who were the progressives? This is really a diverse group, but we can zoom in on a new core group of professionals, women, civil rights advocates, and high-ranking politicians like the progressive presidents. So stay tuned for part 2 of the progressive era.